Hello and welcome to the class of monthly current affairs, that is recitals in depth. Here we will be covering key topics from science and technology section featured in the month of August. We'll explore the type of telescopes, especially the Growth India telescope recently which captured an astonishing asteroid. Then we will learn why there is a craze of genetic screening which is increasing among the athletes. Then what are the unique kind of organisms named as extremophiles? Then what is dysbiosis, which could be caused due to abuse of antibiotics? Then what is the phenomena of super blue moon? What are forever chemicals, which was a featured topic in prelims 2024 this year? And some other interesting concepts. To understand more in detail, stay tuned. Now previously, we were talking about the viability of having a thorium-fueled nuclear power plant. Has it seen the reality of the day anywhere in any part of the world? Yes, it is becoming a reality, and that is the context of our next article, which is that China is now going to produce world's first thorium-fueled nuclear power plant. Talking about thorium, the thing is, of course, it is a radioactive material. It comes under the series of actinides, which I have already taught to you. But at the same time, it is not automatically fissile in nature. It needs to be converted into a form of uranium so that it can fuel the power plants, because this form of uranium will be naturally fissile. Fissile means by the very virtue of its existence, it is able to release of the electrons, the outer electrons, with the least amount of energy input. Now, what happens is thorium, which is having a mass of 232, when it is bombarded with neutrons, when it is bombarded with a neutron, then it will become thorium 233. But we know that 233 is also an isotope of uranium, and this uranium is automatically fissile. And even more so, when more neutrons are bombarded into it, let's say I add one more neutron into it, then it will get converted into 234 isotope. This is the mass of uranium, this isotope of uranium, which has the efficiency, 95% of efficiency of undergoing fission rather than absorption of the neutron. So what will happen is, when neutrons are bombarded, this thorium will be absorbing more as compared to releasing the neutrons or releasing the energy. So it will not be automatically fissile because it has got certain bandwidth of absorbing more neutrons. But as you move on to uranium 233, uranium 234, and then finally uranium 235, they become more fissile, and now these materials are going to feed our nuclear power plants. I hope you've understood the process, but of course, currently, not many countries have got the technology so that this conversion becomes viable, accessible and affordable for them to drive the nuclear power plants. Only some countries like USA, but still in USA also the thorium power plant is in the nascent stage, but China has developed that technology where now they have created a full-fledged nuclear power plant to create nuclear energy from thorium. But what is going to be the process? The process is ultimately you have to convert the thorium into uranium. Now, China has got rich deposits of rare earth minerals and also some of the important radioactive minerals, for example, uranium. But the concentration of uranium in China is low as compared to the availability of sands, especially located in the Gobi Desert. And those are rich in thorium. So to utilize that raw material naturally so that their import dependence on uranium can cut down, for that they have created this technology. In India also we have got natural deposits and abundant deposits of monazite sands. Where do we have these deposits of monazite sand? I would like you to answer that in the comment section. But anyway, the monazite sands, especially of the coastal areas, now these are the ones which are very rich in thorium. But India has not developed the technology yet. But yes, the creators of our nuclear energy plant have envisaged to use this thorium material as nuclear fissile source or fuel in the third stage of the program. So India's nuclear policy is divided into 3 stages. The first stage that is currently going on uses uranium, an isotope of uranium which is fissile in nature. So it utilizes natural uranium. Of course, this is enriched uranium, enriched up to 5%. And this, when it becomes fissile, it produces plutonium, and in that process it creates a lot of energy because it undergoes nuclear fission process. That feeds our nuclear power plant, and that is how we are able to harness the nuclear energy as of now. The technology that we are using in the first stage, where the raw input is natural uranium, is known as pressurized heavy water reactors, because the coolant that we use over here is heavy water, which is D2O. D2O, in which D is deuterium. This is an isotope of hydrogen. It is responsible for absorbing the excess neutrons so that the plant is secure and it doesn't get exploded due to massive amount of energy being produced. So the role of pressurized heavy water reactor is to, first of all, create the right amount of pressure, and second is to absorb the excessive neutrons. Now, whatever plutonium we are getting, this is a byproduct. Can now I enrich the plutonium and then use it as the raw material or as the fuel source to create nuclear energy again? Yes. So plutonium, if used along with this depleted uranium, if these two are used together, then we will be able to save our reliance on purchasing or importing the uranium from other countries, because the byproduct of one process is going to be the input of the second process. So these kind of reactors, which come under the second stage of India's nuclear policy, these are known as the fast breeder reactors. So fast breeder reactors are using a mix of natural uranium and plutonium. Now, of course, sometimes I'm still basically dependent on uranium, right? So sometimes I would like to, now talking about the stage 3, which is still to be realized. Also, you must remember that it was Homi J. Bhabha who envisaged the 3-stage nuclear policy for India. Currently, we are in the second stage. Many nuclear power plants are in first stage only. And the third stage envisages producing the nuclear energy or electricity using thorium. Thorium having the mass 232, which will, when bombarded with neutrons, will give us a mass of 233, which is a fissile form of uranium. Right? And because India is self-reliant, it's self-sufficient on the amount of thoriums, if we build the right technology, we will be able to create these kind of fast breeder reactors. Also, to make you understand what are the differences between these power plants and the conventional power plant is the fact that we are using the word molten salt nuclear power plant. So generally what happens in other power plants, the coolants are either in the liquid form, in the form of heavy water, or they are in the form of semi-liquid form. But in this case, it is solid, because it is a salt which is being used to absorb the neutrons or the excess energy, which basically means that energy efficiency will increase, and the risk of disaster or collapse will decrease, because the efficiency of a molten salt to absorb the excess energy is much higher as compared to liquid, right? So first of all, here the coolant is a molten salt. In the conventional one, the coolant is either the graphite rods, which are not very efficient. Second, either it is D2O, heavy water, which is in liquid form. Next is, it has a continuous fuel cycle. So basically here, the reactor can operate continuously without refueling. Why is it not requiring refueling? Because when you have got uranium-233, then when it is enriched with neutrons, when it is bombarded with neutrons, then it will produce U-234, which is again a fissile material. If it is again bombarded, then it will produce 235, again an isotope of uranium, which is fissile in nature. It will then produce U-236, U-238, all of them are fissile in nature. And also, this uranium upon fission will create plutonium for me. This is also fissile in nature. So therefore, it has got a continuous fuel cycle because we are using thorium. Okay, so this is how it is different from the conventional power plants. Now the next topic, and a very interesting one. Just think about it, that just by the virtue of walking or sporting or let's say running, you are able to generate electricity for yourself. And also, this electricity can be stored in a grid. So now you are no more dependent on electricity fed from some other sources, especially from the fossil fuel based sources, which means it is not only going to be environmental friendly, but it is also going to be very readily accessible, especially in areas where there are mountains, where the electricity transmission lines couldn't reach up to there. So these kind of technologies are now getting built in India also, and now it is being inducted into our military practices. This technology recently developed by IIT Indore is named as the TENG technology. So our army, our soldiers are now going to use certain footwear or shoes which are equipped with this TENG technology. And when they are walking or when they are running, they will be able to either charge their smartphones, they will be able to charge the grid station which will be fueling the GPS stations which will be fueling the RFID stations. So all of these things will see the reality of the day because of a technology which we know as the triboelectric effect. So the full form of TENG technology is triboelectric nano generator. What is it generating? It is basically generating electricity. From what? From the movement. So which kind of conversion of energy is happening over here? You are converting mechanical energy, that is movement of a person's body, into the electrical energy. So what we are doing? We are converting here mechanical energy into electrical energy. Now, the second concept is, what is a triboelectric effect? Because ma'am, I have never heard of it. So could you please explain to me it in a layman language? Of course. Now have you seen that a comb, when it is repeatedly rubbed off on our hair, the moment you try to move that comb away, our hair also gets attached to it or attracted to it. Why is it happening? Because when two bodies are rubbed off each other, one gets positively charged and the other gets negatively charged. Because of this repeated friction, what gets developed between them is the electrostatic force or the electrostatic current. So triboelectric effect is, by the mechanical rubbing of two substances, is the generation of electrostatic current. Now, if I am able to store this electrostatic current, then I will be able to, and also if I am converting this electrostatic current into the AC form of current and then convert it into the direct current or the DC form of current, then I will be able to feed some basic requirements. For example, to recharge my phone, to recharge the smartwatches, to get to check the impulse. Let's say a person has got a bodily implant and that also requires charging. So that can only be done just by the virtue of walking of that person. Are you getting the point? That is triboelectric effect, okay? And because the person is moving, these two surfaces within the shoe will rub off from each other and will develop significant amount of electricity or electric current, which is basically electrostatic current. This is not going to harm the person himself because of the technology, TENG technology inducted into the shoe. But at the same time, this electricity will be able to charge his personal gadgets. At the same time, this will be stored through the transmission lines and they will finally be stored in a grid. And this can help us to recharge, let's say, the GPS stations, use in the RFIDs, use to charge the phones, and obviously bodily implants. So these are the multiple applications of the TENG technology. So you might be asked a question in the prelims, that TENG technology recently seen in news is related to what? So it is related to conversion of mechanical energy into electrical energy, and it is now being used by our army. This is also important because they are deployed in regions which are very inaccessible. Okay, think about the LOC region. Not a lot of electricity infrastructure has reached over there, but they still require charging, they still require certain technological or surveillance operations to be conducted. Is it possible to do it without electricity? No. The best thing is that they could now create electricity through their own foot. So this, or through their own movement. So this is going to be a very important effort in ensuring the security of our soldiers, securing our borders, and also securing the people of India. And also at the same time ensuring that they get the inaccessible regions, get the access of electricity. Now, the next thing is, we are going to read about the sub-zero temperature batteries. So basically, batteries which can operate in polar regions, in frozen regions, in regions which operate below 0 degrees centigrade, which means in freezing cold areas, these batteries are able to operate where the conventional battery would die down. And this is a news because CSIR has created certain batteries like this. So what are the features of these sub-zero temperature batteries? To understand the feature and their importance, first understand the problem statement which these batteries are going to solve. The first one is regarding conventional batteries, that their efficiency gets drastically reduced or even undergo failure when they go through sub-zero temperature. Because think about a battery cell. It has got anode, it has got cathode, and it has got an electrolyte. These are a typical dry cells. Even if I have a better conventional cell, more developed like a fuel cell, it will not be able to sustain the freezing cold temperatures. So the electrolyte will die down because it will freeze up. It will stop working. Even the cathode would break down, would not be able to sustain that kind of extreme temperature. So basically, the battery not only will have reduced efficiency, but will also have failures. Again, if battery is failing, so definitely in the crazy cold regions, for example, the polar regions, Antarctic, the Arctic, your Norway, Sweden, Finland, etc., the regions would become very inhabitable, right? So in order to fuel those areas, in order to produce electricity in those areas, to produce sufficient amount of charging for, let's say, their automobiles, for that, sub-zero temperature batteries would be a breakthrough. So the first problem it's going to solve is the reduced efficiency or failure of the sub-zero temperature of the batteries which are conventional in nature. Okay. Now the second one, how does it do it? Because it has got a more durable cathode catalyst and it has got an anti-freezing electrolyte which is made up of certain alloys of cobalt. So because of this, they are able to have more durability. Now to understand more about it, we can go and read on the article written in the Recitals magazine, because this topic as such is not very important. But if you ask of the most prominent application that could be there of this particular battery, is basically in electric vehicles which have to be operated in the polar regions, in the regions where there is let's say in the Himalayan regions, where there could be extremely cold temperatures. If you want to deploy EV over there, the normal batteries would not work. So therefore, there would be a requirement of sub-zero temperature batteries. Also think about if you want to propel something into space. Now space is also something, or in the high latitudes, this region is something which is very, very cold. So of course, if you want to deploy any spacecraft over there, any missile over there, at that time also the batteries have to be cryogenic in nature. Now to build a cryogenic kind of battery, it becomes very difficult. What we can do is we can develop sub-zero temperature batteries. So this will not only help us to endeavor in space or in the higher latitudes, but at the same time, it will help us to drive EVs across different geographies of the world, especially the colder ones. So then, as you can see, what are the applications? Applications of any technology is a very important aspect to look for when we prepare for UPSC. It's not really about the technology. You should know the core of the technology, the significance of the technology, the problems that it's going to solve, and also what are the applications. So it's obviously going to be space exploration, better aerospace operations, and also in automotives, especially climate friendly automotives, environmental friendly automotive, that is EVs, electric vehicles. Now recently, last month, two very unique phenomena related to moon were observed together. To understand these unique phases that the moon undergo, because the moon is different at all times, but at the same time, some days moon is completely different. So we observed something which was known as super blue moon last month, and that is why it was in news. Now to understand super blue moon, you first have to understand two concepts, because here the super moon and the blue moon happened together. These two events coincided. So ma'am, what causes super moon and what causes blue moon? To understand that, we all must know that moon is a satellite which orbits around the earth. But of course, it is not orbiting in a perfectly elliptical orbit, which means that it is orbiting, or the orbit is something like this. So there are 2 points. As you can see that this point is more closer to Earth. This is known as perigee. And this point, it is farther from the Earth. It is known as apogee. I hope this much is clear to you. In the case of moon, the difference is not much actually. In the case of perigee, it is 2,25,000 miles, and in the case of apogee, it is 2,52,000 miles. Now, when the moon will be located at perigee, which is at the nearest point, naturally, I will be able to see the largest face of the moon. So the moon in front of me will seemingly become very super, and therefore this biggest size of moon that I'm going to observe that day will now be called as the supermoon, because I've never witnessed such a giant size of moon ever, and that is only happening because of the location of moon. It has now entered into perigee. So when the moon enters into its perigee position, or at least it is 90% inclined into its perigee orbit, then that moon, which appears very giant to the Earth, is known as supermoon. So now I hope you've understood what is a supermoon location. Now the second concept is of blue moon. Now there is a proverb in the English language that somebody who you see very, very rarely, we call them, "Arey, you have become a blue moon." So blue moon, which means an event which rarely occurs. Now what rarely occurs? We know that in 1 month we are able to see only one full moon. One full moon, because between 2 full moons it generally takes 29 days. But sometimes, and in fact very, very rarely, there are some months in which we are able to see 2 full moons. So the first full moon is normal for me, but the second full moon is not normal for me. So this I'll be calling as the blue moon. It is also very vaguely and faintly related to the idea that this moon, because it gets a scattered light, the scattered blue light, and the red light gets escaped away, and therefore this is also known as blue moon. But it is not very much accepted as a theory. The fact that we use it as a blue moon is because of its appearance, sometimes blue, but at the same time also because it is rarely observable. So the second moon of any month, second full moon of any month, is known as a blue moon. So in the month of August, the second full moon was also a super moon located in the perigee. So we saw a very giant blue moon there. That is known as a super blue moon event. Now let me quickly take you through some other unique concepts of moon. First is blood moon. Blood moon means something which is seemingly red in color. Now, why is something red in color? You must have seen during sunrise and sunset, the sky turns red. That is happening because the sun is moving away from the earth, and therefore the light that can only come now is the red light. The last to go is the red light, right? So what happens during blood moon? It occurs during, first of all, the lunar eclipse. What is a lunar eclipse? When this is the sun, this is the moon, and the earth is coming between it. This is when the earth is eclipsing on the moon. It is not allowing the light to fall on the moon. Now, when something is coming, the last light to come and the last light to go will be the red light. So naturally, what I'm observing, what is the color of this moon? This is a red moon or a blood moon. Okay. When will it happen? It will happen only during lunar eclipse. That is only when the red light will be observable. Otherwise, if there is no earth in between, it will receive all the light, and all the light of the spectrum, the 7 colors, Vibgyor colors, when they are combined together, they come into the form of white color. So therefore, naturally, on the normal days, we observe it as white. But if there is certain obstruction, then I will observe only the red color, one which is the first to come and the last to go. Okay. Now, what is a super flower blood moon? Now, a super flower blood moon is when super moon is meeting the blood moon, which means a lunar eclipse is happening and a super moon phenomena is happening, which means lunar eclipse is happening at a position where moon is at its perigee position. Another one, the ring of fire eclipse. Now the ring of fire is happening because now the moon is now seemingly as if it is having a ring of fire around it, and the main object is just black in color, which means the sunlight is not able to come to it. So basically, which means that if I have a source of light behind me and I come in front of it and then I am looking at you, then let's say I am the moon, I am blocking the light coming from there. That is why this face of mine will not appear luminous to you, okay? But at the same time, some parts of that light will come as an aura around me. And that aura will obviously be of reddish color. First light to come, last light to go. So therefore, it will appear as a ring of fire. And when does this happen? This happens during solar eclipse. Because the moon, let's say I am the moon, I am eclipsing the source of light behind me, which is the sun. So when the moon comes in between, this is known as a solar eclipse. When the earth comes in between, then this is known as a lunar eclipse. Okay. Now, the other concepts, micro moon, blue moon, we have already read, harvest moon, cold moon. This is something we are not reading because it's not very important. But please read about this rarest full moons, and I hope the concept is clear to you. Now, do you know what is the typical age of a human being? Are we immortals? Are our cells, the most micro unit of our body, are they immortal? No. They also have certain age limit because ultimately they are going to die down. And all of our cells have got, in fact, our body has got a time clock ticking in it continuously. Because after a point in time, no matter, irrespective of your lifestyle, your diet, your nutrition, your genetics, a human will not be able to survive because their cells will erupt, their cells will die. And this limit, this age limit of each cell of a human body, that is referred to as the Hayflick limit. So recently what has happened? Biological researcher Leonard Hayflick, who suggested and innovated this Hayflick limit, which caused the massive breakthrough in the biological sciences for the time to come, has recently died. Okay. According to the Hayflick limit, there is an age limit for human body. Irrespective of our diet, nutrition, genetics, irrespective, no matter even if a person is one of the most healthiest, genetically blessed, it doesn't matter. The Hayflick limit suggests that the maximum age of a human being is only up to 125 years. This is the maximum, because even after, because by this age, even if a person is very healthy, is blessed with good genetics, is having the right nutrition, body working very fine, and is doing all things good without any kind of disease, then also the person will die because person has reached the Hayflick limit, that is of 125 years. Because what is dying in these 125 years? The very basic building block of our body, which are the cells. So there is a limit up till which our cells can grow, after which they will start to die down, and this limit is of 125 years. Hayflick limit also suggests to me that there is a limit up to which my cell can divide, and on an average, a human cell can divide only up to 50 to 60 times in a lifetime. This also is suggested by the Hayflick limit. Now, why is it happening? It happens because, let's say this is our chromosome, that which is holding the genetic material. It has got certain ends, these black ends. These are known as telomeres. So telomeres are the end caps. So every time our cell divides, this telomeres gets shortened up and it starts getting reduced shorter and shorter with every subsequent division. And the moment this telomeres ends, or the moment it collapses, no more further cell division will be possible for the body. So therefore, the Hayflick limit is only of about 50 to 60 times of cell division in a human body in one lifetime. Alright. Now, what is the process of senescence of cell division called, which means that the cell has stopped dividing? That process is known as cellular senescence. So when a cell reaches the cellular senescence stage, it stops to divide, which ultimately leads to its death. Okay. Are all the cells of the body following the cellular senescence? No. There are certain cells, for example, the germ cells, for example, the stem cells, they never undergo this particular cellular senescence, which means because they have longer telomerase which is able to lengthen itself over every division, it doesn't end. Now the next topic is about quantum non-locality. Of course, we are here talking about quantum physics, the themes that we have already read in the previous recitals of superposition, entanglement principle, the Schrodinger's cat experiment. All of that has already been done, but to make you revise it quickly, see what happens is two quantum particles are following quantum physics if they on a level are entangled to each other and they are correlated with their states, which means let's say that there is a state of this material whenever it turns, let's say, into value 1, then ultimately the second will turn into value 0, and when this turns into value 1, it will turn into value 0. This is a kind of entanglement because the state of one body which is under quantum entanglement is linked with the state of another body. So change in the state of one body would cause change in the state of another body. Now it is obviously very easy when we see the computers. In the computers also somewhere this entanglement happens, but in the case of quantum, what it says it also violates the locality principle, which means these two bodies need not to be in the close distance to each other. One body could be located in Earth, the other body could be located in Mars, other body could be located in some other galaxy. Irrespective of the distance, irrespective of the speed of the light at which both of these are moving, speed of velocity that they are moving, they will change their state with respect to other. This principle is known as principle of quantum non-locality. Now, what is the principle of superposition? Superposition means that in quantum mechanics, it is very much possible that a body can exist in two states simultaneously. It's as if you have spinned a coin. That rotation of spinning a coin, during that time, you will not be able to predict whether it is a head or a tail. It is both at the same time. This is the principle of superposition. So we have here read what is principle of superposition, entanglement and quantum non-locality. Okay. Now the next topic is the discovery of the heaviest antimatter. What is antimatter? It is just a matter, a form of a matter, which is having similar size, shape and structure to that of one matter, but at the same time has got opposite charge. So what is the antimatter of electron? Electron is negatively charged, so it is a positron. So if you ask about the mass of the positron, it is not as that of proton. It is not same as that of proton. It is same as that of electron. Mass is same, but the charge is different. So the only difference between matter and antimatter is the difference in their polarity, difference in their charges. What is the antimatter of proton, which is positively charged? It is not electron, because electron has got different charge. Electron has got different mass also. Here it is antiproton, which has got same mass but different charge. That is the difference between particle and that is the difference between matter and antimatter. Now, the heaviest antimatter that has been discovered is anti-hyper hydrogen 4. So again, this question could be asked that this particular term was in news. So this refers to what? It refers to the heaviest antimatter that has been discovered as of yet. This anti-hyper hydrogen, which means that obviously it's a hydrogen. So the number of electrons that it will be having is only one electron, but it is 4 there. So 4 means it has got 4 neutrons. And this is not an antimatter of hydrogen because it has got 4 neutrons, which means the mass is going to be 4. So which element is there in the periodic table whose mass is 4? It's the helium. So it is antimatter of helium. Helium 4 with the mass of 4. Alright. Now what is the difference between antimatter and dark matter? So first of all, antimatter indicates strong interactions, because wherever a matter and antimatter comes together, it leads to huge explosion of energy, right? But dark matter does not interact with any form of matter. Therefore, while we know that 60% of the world universe is made up of dark matter, we do not see it because it does not interact with us, form of matters. Okay. Next, antimatter indicates electromagnetic interactions. But dark matter, is it electromagnetic form of interaction? No, because it doesn't interact with light also. So therefore, it doesn't signify electromagnetic indication. Antimatter has been proven scientifically because we can perceive it, because it interacts with matter. This not proven scientifically. It is just theoretical that we have got dark matter and dark energy. Dark matter is what which keeps our universe together in place. Dark energy is responsible for expansion of the universe. Okay. Now, only a small amount of antiparticles exist in the universe, but the amount of dark matter is far more, beyond 60%. Okay. Now, in order to boost the biotechnology manufacturing, because biotechnology has got vast application, which will make us analyze the applications over here as well. So, Union Cabinet has recently approved the Bio-E3 technology, which stands for biotechnology for 3 E's, that is economy, environment and employment. It is going to focus on these aspects. First of all, creating a net zero carbon economy, which means the amount of carbon that is being emitted or created in an economy is also equivalently getting absorbed. For United Kingdom, the target is to achieve this net zero carbon economy by 2050. For India, which year is targeted? You let me know, because it is already promised in the Panchamrit principles of India. So I hope you are knowing it. Next is Mission Life. Mission Life is creating practices especially on the day-to-day basis for the consumers, for the producers, for the citizens, so that their lifestyles itself are speaking of sustainability. So this is Mission Life, having a holistic change, a kind of lifestyle which is good for the environment. Now this policy covers 6 thematic areas. First of all is to generate bio-based chemicals and enzyme, which mean, let's say the detergent that you have to wash off the stain, can we not use chemicals in it, and instead of it can we use strains of fungi to do the same. So we are creating detergent out of fungi, that is a kind of bioenzyme only. Can I also not create a bio-based chemical, for example a biopesticide, right? Now second is to create functional food and smart protein. So smart protein, for example, lab grown meat, because growing meat, because the meat itself also enhances the carbon footprint because of the enhanced carbon emissions. So we can use lab based meat and some of the functional foods which deliver beyond providing just normal nutrients. For example, a probiotic enriched yogurt. Okay, so it not only delivers a prebiotic to the body, but also probiotic, could also be enriched with, let's say, vitamin D, vitamin C, etc. So these fortified foods are functional foods. Next is to create precision biotherapeutics. For example, gene therapy can be used in creating solutions for climate resilient agriculture. For example, creating drought resilient kind of maize, kind of crops by using the genetic modification technique, which is also a form of biotechnology. Next is carbon capture and its utilization. So CCUS can also be used by bioremediation and by putting some uses of biotechnology. So these are the things which you have to be used in the application part of any question, any mains question which is asking for a biotechnology solution. Okay, and how India has incorporated, and the use and the quotation of this policy would be quite beneficial to you. Now talking about its application, it has got major application in these 3 areas. First is the healthcare, the agriculture and the industry. So basically using biotechnology helps us not just technologically but also socially and economically. Talking about the healthcare, in the healthcare industry, can't we create a medical biotechnology? For example, a gene therapy which can alter, change and modify the gene composition of a body so that we can do away with the inherited genetic diseases. Yes, we can do it. Already being done in the world. So there is Luxturna. So Luxturna is US-based biotechnological solution in order to cure inherited form of blindness. This is a gene therapy. Second, can it also not create vaccines? Of course, because it can use, what is biotechnology? It is using the biological processes. It is using the biological components, organisms, to modify them in such a way that they could come to the service of humankind, to make the human lives better. So this is biotechnology. I know of one process, which is the process of translation, how to create DNA from RNA, RNA to DNA. That is a kind of biological process. To use the same process, I can create mRNA vaccines, were widely used for curing COVID, okay, as a preventive vaccine for COVID. So mRNA vaccine is a good example of biotechnology induced vaccines. Next is to create monoclonal antibodies. Sometimes the body is not equipped enough to have enough or to give enough immune response to the incoming disease. So what if I induce certain kind of proteins or antibodies? So these bodies are known as monoclonal antibodies. They can again take use of the immune process of the human body, and with the help of this we'll be able to create these antibodies which can induce immunity. Next is in agriculture. So think about it, we've got BT brinjal, we have got BT cotton. So what are these? These are genetically modified crops with the help of biotechnology only. So we can create GM crops, we can create biopesticides also, because what is BT in this? The BT is basically inducting a part or a gene of a bacteria which is able to perform in such a way that it keeps the pest away. In the case of BT cotton, it keeps the pink bollworm pest away from the crop naturally. So it's a biopesticide. So we have this example. Then it can also lead to biofortification. The wheat that I am growing, the rice that I am growing could also be naturally and genetically enriched with, let's say, vitamin A, so that I don't need to take pills of it additionally. So for example, we have got golden rice, which is the rice fortified with vitamin A, appearing golden in color. So this is also going to take care, safeguard of the nutritional security of the country. Okay, these are the agricultural ones. Next is the industrial biotechnology. It can be used in creating biofuels, bioplastics. For example, the polylactic acid is a biodegradable kind of plastic. Okay, it can be used in bioremediation to deal with the pollutants. Okay, so for example, in Alaska, there was an oil spill in the Exxon Valdez region. So this oil spill was remediated by the use of some bacteria only, and they were genetically modified to absorb this excess oil. So these are some of the applications of biotechnology. And now the last topic of this month's recital. It is the solar paraboloid technology. So it is nothing but a more efficient way of harnessing the solar energy and to create better and highly efficient electricity from it. This is with the help of just twisting the shape of the solar panels or the solar mirrors which were receiving solar energy. Therefore, it is known as solar paraboloid technology. Why was it required? What was the problem statement that it was going to solve? Let's look into it first. Because the solar panels were plain, were in single dimension, so therefore they were not able to capture the energy that much efficiently, because it was not able to convert the amount of energy. In fact, the energy output of any solar appliance is, let's say, the solar panel is receiving 100 units of energy. At an average, it will only be able to collect and converge only 30 to 40 units of solar energy. So what is the efficiency? It is only averaging 30%. This is for a normal solar panel, and that is why a lot of energy was getting wasted. So we required a better solution which could not only receive it from all the sides, receive the solar energy, but could also, because of the virtue of its size and shape, could converge this solar energy so that the solar efficiency or the electricity generated out of the input received will be higher. Okay, so the first problem it solves is inefficient energy capture, because it captures it more easily. Because think about a parabola. What is a parabola? This is an eclipse. If I cut one part of an eclipse, then this cut part is known as a parabola. You must have already read it in the calculus classes, in the geometric classes of your 10th standard. Now, a parabola has got the ability to converge the light rays. So the energy capture is more efficient. Okay. Second, the cost and scale of the solar power rises because the amount of electricity that it is producing per unit solar energy received is higher. It is higher in this case, and it is said that it will be able to capture up to 60 units of energy, create up to 60% higher efficiency of solar output. Okay, next problem of intermittency and reliability. So what happens with solar energy? When the sun is there, there is electricity. When the sun is not there, there is no electricity. So first of all, when the sun is there, the amount of electricity generated should be more productive, more efficient, should be more scalable. That is already done with the help of changing the shape. But what we also need to do is to create certain storage systems so that we can also utilize solar energy when sun is not there. Okay, so for this we have to integrate, we have to create a mixed bag of solar energy and thermal power plants together, or at least create storage structures. This is also required. Okay, next, reducing the fossil fuel dependence and emission, because in this case, what are we using? We are using renewable source of energy. Okay, so is it replenishable? Of course. So in the paraboloid technology, what are we going to use? Look into this image. We are going to use something like a dish antenna. So this dish antenna, when it will receive the rays of the sun coming from an infinity point, they will ultimately converge it to the focus area. The shape of this disc antenna is of that of parabola or a paraboloid, and that is why it is known as a paraboloid technology. It is going to have a highly reflective cover. It is going to be made of mirror as compared to our dish antennas or as compared to our TV antennas. And the reason for this is because light can only be converged and it can only be reflected better if the surface is more reflective. So what am I going to use? Am I going to use a lens or am I going to use a mirror? Of course, we are going to use a mirror because mirrors are more reflective. Now, talking about the mirror, am I going to use a convex mirror, which is shaded from this side? This is the reflective surface of a convex mirror. Or am I going to use a concave mirror? Here is the reflective surface, so it will be receiving light from here. Which of the following mirrors are converging in nature? Of course, concave mirrors are converging. At the same time, when it comes to lenses, convex lenses are converging. So please remember this fact because this could be asked in the examination. That which of the following lenses and mirrors are converging in nature and which are diverging. So of course, concave lens and convex mirrors are diverging. These are diverging and these are converging. And this calls us, and this brings us to the end of the recitals discussion of the month of August. In case you get any query or doubt regarding it or science and technology in general, feel free to reach out to us. So all the very best for your studies. Take care. Bye.